host in the back for providing us with snacks this evening. Thank you. Thank you. Also, if you haven't already, there's a set of QR codes to check in. The city of San Jose usually likes to know how much we're using the facilities and who's here. It's almost anonymous. It's the first name, last initial, and your zip code, just to let the city know that we're making use of their property. It is my honor and privilege this evening to introduce Eric Brickmont. We were just reminiscing how long I've known Eric. I think Eric was about that tall.
I think we settled I was about 3 years old.
Yeah, about 3 years old. And I had a lot more hair and it wasn't gray. But this evening, Eric does a wonderful job giving history talks at the Evening with the Stars and Music of the Spheres up at Lick. He's just loaded with a lot of fun facts and history about the observatory, and I'm sure we're going to learn a lot more that we already didn't know about the observatory. So
that's the goal.
Okay,
yes.
Take it away, Eric.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Larry. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me here. Thank you to the SJAA. I've known Larry, as we've said, for a long time now, and there's a few familiar faces in the room as well, and so I look forward to kind of getting to know you all today, maybe after today's talk, if you want to come up and chat, certainly about opportunities for volunteering at the observatory. I am always looking for new volunteers, so please let me know if you're interested. But tonight, I've been introduced, or I've been brought here tonight to share with you a talk that I give pretty regularly up at Lick Observatory, which I've titled A Journey Through the Eras. And tonight we're going to go over nearly 200 years of history. We've got a lot to cover and not a whole lot of time to do that. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Yeah, exactly, yes. So let's start first with the man whose legacy is the observatory, and that is James Lick, California's very first millionaire. James was a self-made man, not born into wealth by any means, and instead spent a good portion of his life working as hard and as honest as possible and made a very decent amount of money. Towards the end of that life, he had to decide what he was going to do with it. And many ideas had come up, but one thankfully stuck. And that was the building of the world's largest telescope at the time in the very first mountaintop observatory. And so it's fitting, of course, that we begin our talk with James Lick, and let's take a very quick look at his life in this first section, which I've titled From Gift to Observatory. Now, James was born in Stumpstown, Pennsylvania in August 25th, 1796. The eldest of 7 children. He was born into a rather simple log cabin. This is an illustration created by his nephew showing approximately what it looked like at the time at which James lived there. His father was a rather stern gentleman, but very hardworking and a very skilled carpenter. His mother took care of the home and the home industry, the cottage industry, and had quite the green thumb, enjoyed spending a lot of time out in the garden, something that James would pick up from her. Like many of the eldest children at that time, they would take on the apprenticeship with their father, and James himself would learn to become quite skilled at carpentry. While his father focused mostly in cabinet making, James had quite a skill that was going to surpass his dad. It was very obvious from a very early age, and due to some rather interesting circumstances, James would leave Stumpstown to pursue a career in piano making. Now, you've probably never heard of Stumpstown, and that's because they changed the name a really long time ago. It was named after their first pioneer who settled it, a man by the name of Stumps, who fell out of favor, and they decided to vote to change the name of the town, instead becoming a small, unincorporated little section in Pennsylvania, now called Fredericksburg. Very small. As you can see from the photo here, not a large population, still not a large population. Under 2,000 people live there to this day. But due to circumstances involving a young mill owner's daughter, an unplanned pregnancy, and a refusal of marriage on the behalf of her father, James decided to leave town and pursue some endeavors to make himself a wealthy and successful man. As I mentioned, he learned to create fine pianos, like the one that you see in the image here. He took on his apprenticeship in Baltimore, Maryland, performed it quite admirably, and then opened his first shop in New York City. Now, very quickly, started selling his pianos and realizing that his pianos were not only being purchased locally, but then bought and exported to South America, where they were being sold at a pretty greatly increased rate. And James, wanting to corner the market, decided to export himself to South America as well. And so this would begin a 30-year journey where he would travel throughout South America, first setting up himself in Buenos Aires, Argentina, struggling a little bit at first, not knowing the language, having some ill health, not being particularly fond of the boat ride that got him there. But he recovered quickly and established himself as a hardworking, honest man, great at making his pianos. Unfortunately, political turmoil would lead to him being forced out of Argentina and making his way to Chile, where he would remain for, again, just a short time before being forced to move to the final place in which he lived in South America, Lima, Peru. He would spend most of his time in South America here in not just selling pianos, but also investing in the local fur trade and a few other local industries and making a pretty decent amount of money. By 1846, James, now 50 years old, had genuinely prospered in South America, but had long desired to return to the United States. Rather than going back to the East Coast, however, he decided to make his way to the fledgling West Coast of the United States, to California. Now, the conclusion of the Mexican-American War in 1846 saw America now expand, and with that, California become this whole new territory, soon to be a state. James thought this was going to be the perfect place for him to establish himself fresh and new. And so he returned to the United States via what would later be known as San Francisco in January of 1848. He brought with him his tools, his workbench, and an ironclad chest full of $30,000 in Peruvian gold, equivalent to approximately $1 million in today's money. He also brought with him 600 pounds of chocolate. Chocolate that a good friend of his and next-door neighbor had made that he intended to sell to the people of San Francisco, which he did, and they bought up rather quickly, so much so that he then sent a letter back to his friend. And I don't know exactly what the letter said, but I can imagine it sounded something like, "Domingo, you should really come to San Francisco and sell your amazing Ghirardelli chocolates. Everybody absolutely loves them." Thankfully, he did for all of us. Now we all get to enjoy Ghirardelli's chocolates. But arriving in San Francisco, there wasn't much to be seen. It was really just a shanty town with approximately 1,000 inhabitants, a bunch of shacks, mud flats, nothing much. But James saw a natural harbor where people would rush to, no doubt. And so he decided to start buying up as much land as possible. And by mid-March of that year, had acquired 37 lots of property in San Francisco. Now, those of us who remember our California history, what happened shortly after the start of 1848? Yeah, well, James didn't know it, nobody knew it, but just a few weeks after his arrival in San Francisco, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California, and the gold rush was on. Within 10 years, California would explode along with San Francisco, which now would have 20,000 inhabitants. And there was James with considerable amount of property ready to sell at a rather upticked rate. And he did. And in doing so, became California's first millionaire almost overnight. Now, James would continue to invest in the Bay Area, including a beautiful mansion that he had created for himself in Santa Clara. It is still there today. It's, interestingly enough, now surrounded by a gated community. You can actually go and visit it if you're really nice to the reception person there and you just say that you want to go in and check it out. It is technically separate property there inside in the middle of this gated community, and so you can't actually go onto the property, but they do rent it out for parties and such. In addition to his beautiful mansion, he also had constructed a gorgeous 5-star hotel known as the Lick House. And this was located at the corner of Montgomery and Center. And it was the finest hotel you could find on the West Coast. It would remain there until 1906. And unfortunately, along with about 90% of San Francisco, would also burn to the ground. Anyone ever been here? Conservatory of Flowers in Golden Gate Park? Well, it was actually purchased as a kit meant to be constructed in San Jose by James Lick. He wanted to give it as a gift to the people of San Jose until a rather nasty article was written about him in the Mercury News, and he decided against it. Instead, it just kind of sat there along with some of his other property until it was eventually purchased up by the city of San Francisco and then constructed in Golden Gate Park. Perhaps his biggest purchase was the entirety of the island of Catalina. And so there, at the time, there really wasn't much. James purchased it in hopes of maybe developing the site, but never got around to it. Eventually, it would be sold off, and he would just end up being one of the many people who owned Catalina Island in that period of time. Now, James obviously had considerable wealth. He could live anywhere he wanted, but where he felt most at home was right here in San Jose. This was his homestead. And even though he had this incredible mansion that he could live in if he wanted to, this is where he preferred to live. He wasn't born into wealth, remember. He was a self-made man. He had very fond memories of his mother out there working in the garden. And so he himself also had a bit of a green thumb, developed quite an orchard that he maintained and kept up. And it would be here on one evening on his 77th birthday in 1873 that alone in his kitchen he would suffer a stroke. Now, the stroke was not fatal, but it was very debilitating. He was found the next day by one of the few friends that he maintained through his life, a man named Thomas Fraser, who we'll know a little bit more about soon, and brought to recover at his fine hotel in San Francisco. But the writing was on the wall. It was very clear that James would not be recovering from this, and he needed to figure out what he was going to do with this rather substantial wealth before the end came. Now, James did have family, but most of them were estranged, especially his son, who he had actually never met in his life up to this point. And he would eventually call for his son. His son would come out to live with him for a short time, but the relationship was strained from the very beginning. And so the decision really was to not include him in that will, not to hand over all of this tremendous wealth. Instead, he would give it to the people of California, his adopted home, and a variety of different projects that money would go to. Thankfully, he was friends with two very important astronomers at the time. George Madeira, California's very first official astronomer, who set up the first observatory in Volcano, California, followed by George Davidson, who was, of course, the famous president of the Academy of Sciences, well-known astronomer, geographer. These two men were friends with James. They had the opportunity to whisper into his ear, to give him some ideas. And there were some rather interesting and somewhat outlandish ones that had been proposed. Some of them may just be myth, like building a pyramid in the middle of San Francisco to outdo the Great Pyramid of Giza. Almost certainly all of that's blown out of proportion. But thankfully, one giant idea was dropped into his mind, and that was to build the world's largest telescope. And not just to build it anywhere, but to build it in the very first mountaintop observatory. And so plans were put into effect, a trust was created, and the idea then came to life. Here you can see a very early rendering of what that telescope may have ended up looking like. It would be a large refracting telescope. After some debate, it was decided that that was the way to go, as it was the proven technology at the time. But it would be massive. So how would you get to the eyepiece? Well, there are all sorts of interesting ideas that were brought forth, including mobile scaffolding and so on. And they really had to figure this all out because up to this point, pre-1888, observatories were very different than what we see now and what we expect. Most of them were built in or around major universities, typically down at lower elevations where the seeing is not quite as ideal. And then if they were built In cities, they were dealing with light pollution and air pollution, and of course, if the cities near them expanded, they would deal with the same exact problem. And so the decision instead was to build atop a mountain. And the location at Mount Hamilton, I should say, where Lick Observatory is now, was decided upon. And at 4,200 feet elevation, it is a pretty good site, especially at a time before, the advent of modern electricity. And so things were perfect and ideal. Viewing conditions were fantastic. Weather was great. It was decided this is where the world's largest telescope would go. And so 1876 saw construction begin on the road that would bring all of those materials and everything up to the top of that mountain. There was a work crew of 150 men, and it was by no means a simple process. This was all in an age before powerful machinery could be used to build a road. Instead, most of the work was done by hand or by steers that were pulling along or horses that were pulling along, trowels and what have you. It was difficult work. A number of people actually died at the very beginning in the outset of the construction of the road, and it was found that the mismanagement that was going on was so extreme that Santa Clara County was brought in instead to take over the job. And thankfully, they got things back working, work conditions improved, and the road was actually completed in less than a year. And so by December of 1876, with work complete, they gathered atop to celebrate where they would build this fine telescope. Unfortunately, James would never live long enough to see this process actually happen. He died on October 1st, 1876, just a few months before the road was completed. And work would then stall for nearly 3 years, as that son that I had mentioned, who was largely estranged from him, contested the will. And it ended up becoming a bit of a legal challenge. Thankfully, the $700,000 that had been put aside for the building of the observatory was safe and secure. And so the trust, composed of several men, but most importantly these three, had Richard S. Floyd, a former Navy man, well-trusted, well-respected, put in charge of the trust as its president. We also had Simon Newcomb, who was the prominent astronomer in America at that time out of the U.S. Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. And then to build it all was that trusted friend of James Lick, Thomas Fraser, who had served as his foreman on many projects before. He would be responsible for making sure the construction of the observatory happened. These three men made their way up to that mountain and oversaw the construction of what would be a very difficult and very lengthy process. By 1881, the very first structure of the observatory was completed, and this is the dome facing towards the north there, where it houses a 12-inch Clark refractor, at least it did originally. Here you can see it was composed of 32,000 bricks. Now, the very first formal visitor to the observatory also occurred right around that time. We hosted the King of Hawaii, Kalakaua, and he was recorded as saying when he returned back to Hawaii in the newspapers that he was quite impressed by his trip to Lick Observatory and going up to a mountain to look through a telescope. In fact, he thought Hawaii should have a telescope up on a mountain. Turns out it worked out pretty well, for the most part. Now, in that dome was a, by today's standards, small 12-inch Clark refractor. And it would remain in that dome until 1979. It would be the first research telescope up on the mountain, and it would get a lot of very important work done. But there would be another important event that would occur during construction. And for that, and a few other structures were built, we have a small transit house pictured over in here. Now, in that transit house was a 4-inch telescope used for observing stars as they would pass over the meridian. And this was used for very precision timekeeping. That data was then actually sold in one of the first passive revenues that the observatory would be able to generate. And so the timetables for the trains in San Francisco were being set on Lick Observatory's star time. December 6th of 1882 would see the transit of Venus. And with that would be a variety of photographic telescopes that would be brought up here for use. This would, of course, not happen again for another 130 years. I myself actually got an opportunity, I think Larry, you were there too, when we went up to the observatory to view the transit at that time, back in 2012, if I remember correctly. And here you can see a photoheliostat that was created for the transit and then, of course, for future use. With that was captured this image on a glass plate of Venus passing in front of the sun from our perspective here on Earth. Now, I told you earlier that that telescope, the 12-inch, the dome for it required 32,000 bricks. Well, there'd be a lot more bricks needed to build the rest of the observatory. And rather than hauling all of these materials up here, which would have been incredibly difficult, the Fraser, I should say, the foreman, was able to scout and find a perfect source of natural clay that right there on the mountain, just a few miles away from the mountaintop, could they build a brickyard and save not just on time, but also on construction materials by creating and building all of their own bricks. And they would do so, and they would work in earnest up until 1884. The building would come along, and then they had to stop. Another major delay was introduced, and that was the building of the world's largest telescope. No one had ever constructed a refracting telescope this large before. Particularly, its lens proved to be incredibly difficult to create. Here we can see Floyd along with the lens shortly after it was unboxed and delivered at the observatory. But that took a long time to make that happen. And you wouldn't have the rest of the observatory until this process was done. You wouldn't know exactly how large to build the dome in which it would be housed until you had the optics completed, and then you would be able to understand the focal length of that telescope. And so with that delay came a lot of time, a lot of money, all of which were being spent without much to show for. But when it was done, you had an absolutely magnificent lens. Here you can see it's made of two different elements. So you have a crown lens and a flint lens. The crown lens was nearly 2 inches thick at its center, but just about a ½ an inch thick at the outer edge. So very delicate. And creating glass that delicate could fall to only one person, Charles Fayel of the House Fayel in Paris, famous Parisian glassmakers. Unfortunately, he had been forced out of the company by his sons, who had taken over. And they took over the contract. And it took 18 failed attempts before they finally had the glass that they could use to create that lens. The solution was actually quite elegant. It was fire the sons and bring back the dad. And as a father of 4, I greatly appreciate that. And so do they, apparently. Wow. I didn't even know they could hear me from here. Thank you. Thank you. Now, once you had a piece of glass, you had to turn it, of course, into a lens, and that fell to Alvin Clark and Sons, where they would craft this beautiful, magnificent, and delicate lens, which then had to make its way up to the top of Lick Observatory. And that was an incredibly difficult process. After it had been crafted, it had to be transported, and it was done so by special railway, where the car had to be built with specifically designed shock absorbers to prevent any damage from happening to the lens along the way. Fraser and Floyd would actually watch very carefully on top of the mountain using telescopes to look down onto the road and watch as the lens came up extremely slowly by horse-drawn carriage, taking a couple of days to complete that journey. Finally, it did arrive 2 days after Christmas in 1886, and with that, they could now finally start work. But there was one very important task that needed to be completed first. Now, James Lick, as I have mentioned, died 11 years before the completion of the observatory. His original burial was in San Francisco, quite to a bit of fanfare. There was a lot of people who came out to the streets of San Francisco to see his hearse move by. But his final wish was to be buried along with his legacy. And so his body was exhumed and then reburied January 9th, 1887, at the very base of the pier that would hold his magnificent telescope. He has the distinction of being the only man in the world buried beneath a telescope. That is for now, because in my will, it very clearly states that my 8-inch Schmidt-Cassia grain is going right up above my tombstone. But you're going to have to wait a really long time for that, I'm sorry. Now that we had James in place, we could begin work finally constructing this enormous dome. But with it presented quite a few challenges. For example, how would you get to the eyepiece to actually make your observations? Would you have to just rely on a series of larger and larger ladders? Instead, a gentleman by the name of Grubb came up with a rather ingenious idea, an elevating floor. At that time, it was the world's largest elevator. It would remain in that class of large elevators, along with the Yerkes Observatory, built 9 years later, up until the advent of the modern aircraft carrier. Those were really the two biggest moving platforms on the planet. It would be powered by water, and it would be powered by a water engine. So, brought in was the Ironworks of San Francisco. They were really the only ones who had the skill necessary to make this happen. They built the absolutely massive dome that would be housing the telescope there, made of galvanized steel plates on the outside to protect it from the weather. And then wood paneling would have been placed on the floor there in these beautiful circular design. A design that I think if James had lived long enough, he would have very much approved, being the expert carpenter that he was. But where this is really fascinating is what happens underneath, here in the basement. So here you see a shot from about 8 months before the observatory actually was handed over to the university and went live. And it's a little bit tricky to see in here, but there are these areas. I'll use my trusty cane as a pointer here. Right here, this rod. There are 4 of these. These are screw jacks. Those screws would turn and it would actually elevate the floor, and then you would lock it in place, release the locking mechanism, and allow it to fall down naturally under its own weight, counterbalanced by the near same weight. This was very effective, but it was extremely slow. So slow that they actually decided to abandon this process before the observatory even opened, and instead replaced them with hydraulic rams. They had the same exact effect, they just were able to work a bit faster. And with that, you could raise the floor 17 feet up in the air, allowing the observers to get right up next to the eyepiece, or swap out large, heavy pieces of equipment easily without having to reposition the telescope. It was absolutely genius. And this 26-ton floor was almost as big a project as the actual telescope itself. Now, Warner and Swayze were brought in to assemble the pier and the tubing, and of course, make sure the lens was in place. And with that, you have this beautiful refracting telescope, the second largest refracting telescope ever built. They only ever built one larger, and that is, of course, at the Yerkes Observatory, the 40-inch. But this telescope outperformed the 40 on most nights, while the 40, of course, did magnificent work, amazing work, groundbreaking work. They were plagued by less than ideal conditions in which the telescope was built. And so, because of that, the weather really was not comparable to that here on Mount Hamilton. So even though it wasn't quite as powerful, this telescope continued to truly outperform in the amount of science that it was able to produce. I'm sure you're wondering, because I've got a whole room full of amateur astronomers in here. So the focal length, or the focal ratio, is an f/19. Actually perfect for photography, not that bad. It had a pretty decent field of view. And it was 57 feet long and 14.5 tons in weight. Absolutely massive. And yet it is so perfectly counterbalanced that you can grab a hold of it and you can just move it around easily. I've done it before. It's pretty cool. Therefore, I'm an authority on how cool it is. Now, no expense was spared in the construction of this observatory, including the interior, which was absolutely gorgeous and still remains beautiful to this day. And now that things were done, it was time to get to work. So let's move on to our next section here, which I like to call Trailblazers. And we'll start with the very first director of the observatory, because the observatory was handed over in 1888 to UC Santa Cruz. Its first director was Edward Holden, not exactly the greatest astronomer in the world. He accidentally discovered the same moon of Mars, again. But he was very good at what he did in terms of, organizing, reaching out, public outreach in particular. In fact, he was the originator of the public program nights that have existed at Lick Observatory since 1888. Those nights that Larry was talking about just a moment ago, we still do these, and we have to thank Edward Holden for that. Not everyone got along with him terribly well, however. He was a difficult personality. And those first few astronomers that were there were constantly battling with him for telescope time, and in spite of that, they still managed to do some pretty impressive work. You might recognize at least one of the names up here. If you've ever observed Barnard's star, then you probably are at least somewhat familiar with Edward Emerson Barnard. Now, William Wallace Campbell, you may not be overly familiar with, and I'll expand on him a little bit more, but let's talk about Mr. Burnham here in the middle. He was actually one of the greatest double-star observers in history, cataloging over 13,000 double-star pairs. And yet, he never had a formal education. He was all self-taught. Even still, he was the elder of the astronomers when the observatory opened, and was there, of course, to help guide his younger colleagues. He was also the very first one to observe at that location at Mount Hamilton. He had been sent up for a multi-night survey to make sure the site was ideal. And thanks to him and his positive reporting, the observatory got the green light to be built. Now, Barnard made several very important discoveries within his time, Barnard's star being just one of them. But the observatory he made while working at Lick was the discovery of Almathea, and that is Jupiter's fifth moon. Up to this point, over 200 years had passed since a moon of Jupiter had been discovered by Galileo, and so this was a very big deal. It would go on to reveal that Jupiter has many moons, and this was just the first after the Galilean to have been identified. Here you can see an image of the actual observer's notes that Barnard had taken from his first visual observations that he had made. Now, most observations at that time, of course, were made by eye. And then you had your notebook and you recorded your observations. You would typically illustrate and draw them. But the fledgling science of spectroscopy really found a home at Lick Observatory. And here we see an image on the right of William Wallace Campbell. With it is the Mills spectrograph, and you'll find it actually in the Smithsonian to this day. A very important piece of history in that it really kind of proved that spectroscopy was going to be the way to study stars in the future, to take their individual components of light, break them down, and really learn their properties. It would be because of much of the work that Campbell would do that spectroscopy is where it is today. It was able to find a real incredible home right there at Lick. To give you an idea of how this telescope was used, I have a very short film to show you that was shot in 1925. We'll find an elder Campbell, then director of the observatory, overseeing a demonstration of its operation. It does not have sound. What's the old saying? They don't make them like they used to. Now, of course, observations done by eye were often then recorded and illustrated. These fine pairs of illustrations were created by a man named James Edward Keeler. Keeler would actually go on to be the second director of the observatory, and again started his, or continued his career at Lick Observatory, doing a lot of very important work. He was incredibly well liked by the staff. He was well educated. He was a much more successful director than his predecessor. And he was also quite the accomplished astronomer, proving that Saturn's rings were in fact not solid. It would be because of the work that he did in Doppler shifts, showing that the rings themselves actually move faster with the outer material, that it wasn't just one big solid piece. He also helped to move forward astrophotography in a pretty big way. And that was thanks to another very important telescope that was actually bought secondhand. Now, are you familiar at all with the name Andrew Common? Yeah, pretty familiar. If you've ever made a telescope, you probably know about him. He was an optics expert and designed actually the very first telescope to have a glass mirror that was then covered in silver nitrate. That mirror was this telescope right here, what would later become known as the Crosley 36-inch. Common actually sold this telescope because he was planning on building another one, a better one, and sold it to English aristocrat Edward Crosley. He took up the hobby, built a beautiful dome and structure to go along with it, and there are some who say it was actually at the insistence of his wife that he gave up the hobby. It wasn't going to happen anymore. Sorry. Instead, he decided rather than just selling the telescope, why don't I donate it? And so he donated it for free to Lick Observatory. All we needed to cover was $1,000 for the shipping. And with that, the original dome still sits on the mountain today along with the telescope. Of course, a foundation had to be constructed for it, but the dome was brought over and reassembled, as you can see in these images here. And the telescope was in desperate need of its own renovations. And so over a period of years, that's exactly what would happen to it. Looks like a completely unrecognizable telescope, but it is still the same optics. This would be the telescope that Keeler would use to do some really extraordinary work, again, in the field of astrophotography. Still very much in its infancy at that time. In fact, Andrew Common, the one who built that telescope, was the very first one to really be recognized for taking a picture of the Orion Nebula. And instead, Keeler doubled down on that and did significantly more work, showing that there were lots of nebula of lots of different variety, including these rather strange, what were called spiral nebula, which we now know today are in fact galaxies. If he had lived longer, I strongly believe that he probably would have beaten Hubble to the punch, and we would have the Keeler Space Telescope having taken all those amazing pictures. Unfortunately, his life was cut short as he did die in 1900. We're not entirely sure why. It's suspected it was probably cancer. Very unfortunate, as he was a pretty incredible astronomer. But let's transition a little bit, because we've talked a lot about the science so far, but remember, Lick Observatory was a tourist destination, still is to this day. And you could stay at the Hotel Vendôme, where you could get a special package where you would go up to the observatory, get a chance to look around, come on back, and spend your night back here at the hotel. Now, it wasn't an easy trip. Even today, I go up there, I have visitors who come on up and they get out of the car and they're complaining about all the turns on the road. And I have to remind them that back then, it took you 6 hours, horse-drawn carriage, single lane, unpaved road, approximately 360 or so turns along the way. And that usually required stopping frequently in order to water the horses and switch them out. Maybe make some repairs to the carriage if it were to throw a wheel. It was not an easy journey. But if you persevered and you made it up to the top, it was a pretty amazing experience. Let's see actually the very first film ever shot at Lick Observatory. This was shot using an Edison camera, one of two donated by Thomas Edison to celebrate the completion of the observatory. Oh, and a special thank you to my friend Tim at Pioneers Film Archive, who let me use the video. Now, a lot of folks made their way up here in spite of the difficulty, and it was not uncommon to see something like this if you had a pretty busy season with pretty decent weather. And I think it was very much worth the wait, only unfortunately you had just maybe about an hour to look around, and then it was time to head back home. Even still, in the first 4 years the observatory was open, over 22,000 guests came up to visit, just tourists. Not there for science, just there to work to see the world's first mountaintop observatory. Now, if you came up for one of our programs in the evening and you looked through a telescope, you may not want to make that journey all the way back down in the dark. And for those who could afford it, you could actually stay at the Smiths Creek Hotel, just 7 miles from the top of the mountain. It no longer exists, instead is replaced by a CAL FIRE station. But if you do make your trip up to the observatory at some point and you see that CAL FIRE station, a much more updated bridge now exists, you'll know exactly where the hotel was once located. You could also stop on your way up at the Grandview House. Anyone here been to the Grandview restaurant before? Okay, this is not in the exact same location, but still carries that name. Back then, you could stop for a bite to eat or take a sandwich with you up to the top. I imagine it was a bit more affordable than the Grandview is now. Now, the observatory has been around a long time, and as such has weathered quite a few natural disasters, some a little better than others. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But earthquakes, of course, frequent in California, and certainly in 1906, that rather famous earthquake saw some damage up at Lick Observatory. But for the most part, the observatory did rather well. What is rather disturbing, though, is the recordings of the astronomers who actually were able to turn the 12-inch Clark refractor down, look down through it at San Francisco, and watch all of the chaos unfolding as it happened real time. School children who were up there on the mountain, who were walking to school that day, saw plumes and plumes of smoke rising up from the air as, as I mentioned before, about 90% of San Francisco burned to the ground as a result of fires. In 1911, however, there was an even bigger earthquake, one that deeply affected the observatory, but not much else. You've probably never heard of it. It happened on the Hollister Fault Line, just on the south edge of Halls Valley. And there wasn't much there other than, pastures for grazing cows. So there were some probably very surprised cows out there. But the people up at the observatory certainly felt it. And there was rather considerable damage, as you can see from the images that are here. These are all from that 1911 earthquake. That led to the building itself having to be reinforced with concrete in 1916. So they did have to, unfortunately, remove that original brickwork that had been done, replacing it with reinforced concrete. But a lot of those bricks still exist. We kept a decent number of them, and some of them are on display at the observatory in the main hall. Now, right around this time, in fact, 1915, Albert Einstein published 4 rather groundbreaking papers, all on his theory of general relativity. And that began a race around the world, a variety of different scientific institutions, all trying to prove his theory. And the way that they would do that, it was believed, was by observing stars around the edge of the sun during a total eclipse. And if the light from those stars was distorted, not due to weather, but due to space-time, then it would lead to Einstein's theory being at least further enforced, if not proven. And so there were many teams around the world from many different countries who set out to do this. Lick Observatory was right along there with them. And many expeditions were sent out over the years, utilizing specialized cameras designed to photograph during the eclipse. Now, eventually, however, a team led by Arthur Stanley Eddington would beat Lick and everyone else to the punch in 1919. But the results were very controversial. Yes, it did show what could have been proof of Einstein's theory of relativity, but the images were not the greatest, and there were many in the scientific community who disputed their validity. And as such, Campbell, continuing on and leading further expeditions, made his way to Australia, to Wa'al, in 1922. Determined to produce a better photo, a photo that would prove without doubt that Einstein was in fact correct. And here you can see one of the so-called Einstein cameras. It uses massive glass plates, very delicate, all had to be worked on and executed in the field. This was not something that was simple. And you couldn't just restart. You had a very small amount of time once the eclipse began to make this possible. And if you did manage to get an exposure, you then had to very carefully make sure that that glass plate would not be destroyed before it could be analyzed. But that's exactly what they did. It's very hard to see with the resolution of this photo, but where you see these circles are actually field stars, and those were the ones that were being observed to see if there was any distortion as they were closer to the sun. This image was significantly better than what the Eddington expedition was able to produce, and it went a long way to proving that Einstein was in fact right. We really have to thank this gentleman for it, William Wallace Campbell. I've mentioned him a few times now. He would actually be the third director of Lick Observatory, taking over after Keeler's unfortunate death, and he would serve in that capacity for 30 years. He did a lot of very important work in addition to his expeditions that he led for eclipse studies. He is also known for the work that he's done in radial velocity and the proper motion of stars, a lot of which, of course, he accomplished up there at Lick Observatory. But he's also known to us as a person who helped build a real community. Because for a long time, Lick Observatory was just this remote outpost. When Campbell took over, he really helped transform it into a home. We had a schoolhouse in operation there, which ran up until the early 2000s. Here you can see a few images, including very excited kids over on the right-hand side after they had just completed the playground for the school. He also started the Lick Staff Picnic, a tradition that continues to this day, as well as a 9-hole golf course. That brickyard that he had put together, or had been put together, and the construction of the observatory had now been repurposed, as Campbell was quite the avid golf fan. And as the times changed, so did the methods by which people came to visit the observatory. The automobile really made it much more accessible. And now we had a lot more people taking trips, wanting to try out their new cars. People like my grandfather, who enjoyed driving up to Lick Observatory back a long time ago. In fact, he would have had a drive very similar to the one that I'm going to show you right now. This was made by Jorge Martinez, an amateur filmmaker in the 1930s, and he set out to record what a trip on Mount Hamilton Road would look like. At the time, still just a single lane, a bit more of an improvement over the all-dirt road that had been there prior, but not by much. And it would be some time before it was properly paved. Unfortunately, it never received a truly good foundation, and so you'll find that it does have to have quite a bit of work on the regular. Thankfully, Caltrans, I think, is responsible for it, does a reasonably good job of making repairs. Reasonably. All right, for this, we're going to transition a little bit in tone, because while I've talked about a lot of amazing things that have happened at the observatory has also unfortunately been home to some tragedies. And on an evening in May 21st, 1939, an A-17A attack aircraft, not unlike the one that you see pictured here, flown by Lieutenant Richard F. Lawrence and his mechanic, crashed into Lick Observatory. Unfortunately, both pilot and mechanic were killed. Now, I do have some images, and I do have some video of this as well. I will say that it is not graphic. It is perhaps a bit jarring in that you see the damage, but there is nothing graphic that you will be viewing. Extraordinarily, only the pilot and mechanic were killed. Because the weather conditions were less than ideal that day, there wasn't much staff in the observatory. It was all blanketed by fog, which almost certainly was a contributing factor in the crash itself. Although it was never definitively proven, it was also probably likely due to some sort of mechanical failure or instrumentation failure, some combination of all of these things. Where the crash happened is where the gift shop currently stands in the observatory. And this is the hallway where you can still walk by and actually see where the marble floors are dented, or cracked, I should say, from the engine block of the plane actually being ejected and landing right there on the floor. Somehow, the fuel did not ignite If it had, the observatory would have almost certainly burned to the ground. And so again, while it is most certainly a tragedy, it could have been even worse. Now, the 1930s was also home to the Great Depression, and a lot of scientific institutions were not able to do much work during that time because of the limitations on the economy. Lick Observatory, however, received a very generous donation from the Carnegie Institution in 1934 of $65,000. Now, it wasn't enough to build a large reflecting telescope to compete with Mount Wilson and their large reflectors up there. But it was enough to build a fascinating telescope, one we call the Carnegie Double Astrograph. Now, it's actually 2 in 1. You have two 20-inch refractors, one that is for blue light, the other that is calibrated for yellow light. And the two of them work together almost like a giant pair of binoculars. They photograph the same large patch of sky, and then they allow astronomers to measure the position of those stars over a period of decades, looking for changes that happen. And this was all intended for the Lick Northern Proper Motion Study, a multi-decade-long research project which would help us to understand the proper motions of stars in our own galaxy. And in order to use a reference point, they used distant galaxies that remained relatively static, allowing us to see those changes in positions of the stars. But this actually gave us a really amazing opportunity because these photographs that were being taken with this photographic telescope were incredibly detailed. They were captured on these massive 17 by 17 inch glass plates. And because it was a double astrograph, it really helped flatten the image. It made it so that around the edges it wasn't nearly as distorted. This was perfect opportunity for those of us who wanted to go in there and count just how many galaxies were there. Over a period of decades, over 1 million galaxies were counted and cataloged manually. There was no AI back then, okay? So it all had to be done by eye with the magnifying glass and counting off each one as you go. But that actually, I think, had an even bigger impact than the original project in which this telescope was designed for. Lick Observatory was one of the first places in the world to show that galaxies, they don't just go out there and are all flown around willy-nilly. You know, they have an actual structure to them. They exist in these clusters and filaments, and it was Lick Observatory that was able to help first show that that was a thing. Now, I know I'm speaking largely to a room full of amateur astronomers, so I made sure to include a slide I don't normally include in my general public talk just for you, but I wanted you to know this is all for you. Okay. George Tachman in 1937 constructed at that time the world's largest amateur telescope in Oakland, California. Now, this 22-inch reflector would serve him pretty well up until about the 1950s. And by that point, the light pollution coming out of Oakland was getting much worse, and George decided that he was going to donate the telescope. And so he gave it to Lick Observatory. And it's been housed in its own dome, rightly named the Tachman Dome, since 1945. Now, it's not a research telescope. It really never has been. But it is a fine telescope, and you'll find that many of the astronomers who live up on the mountain, when they have their own free time, do like to take advantage of this telescope and use it for their own personal observations. Now, in 1945, Charles Donald Shane, I should say, took over the directorship of Lick Observatory. And he had a vision. He wanted to bring Lick Observatory into the modern day. Because by this point, many other observatories had far exceeded the capabilities of what we could do up on the mountain. Just look at Palomar with its 200-inch telescope. It was the largest telescope in the world. And so, we didn't want to build a bigger one. We just wanted to build the second biggest one. That was achievable at that time, post-war. Amazingly, Charles Shane made it happen. And it was part of an effort in further upgrading the mountain, which brings us into our next era. Now, if things had gone as planned, this telescope would have been in operation in 1947. However, post-war, there were a lot of limitations in terms of manpower, a lot of limitations in terms of materials, general cost, inflation, everything was going up. And so the telescope, unfortunately, wouldn't be completed until later. The initial plan pushed out to 1952. But when it was built, it would be the second largest reflecting telescope in the world. It'd be incredibly powerful, and it would be built at a relatively cheap cost, only about $2.2 million. The reason it was able to be so affordable is because of its mirror. Now, this beautiful 120-inch, 3-meter Pyrex mirror was actually originally constructed by the team at Palomar. It was designed as a test flat. They were going to use it to make sure that they could actually scale it up and build a larger mirror for the 200-inch. But once it was created, there was no need to actually grind it and put it into any other shape. And so they'd proven it, and it just stood in storage. That was until Shane found out about it and was able to negotiate at a rather affordable price the purchase of it so that we ourselves could use it to build the second largest refracting telescope. Now, once it was finished, it had to be packaged and it had to be transported. And again, we have another rather ingenious railway invention to go along with another reflecting surface heading up to the observatory. Although it was a bit of a tight fit. Once it arrived, it needed to be illuminized. And that process was done in a massive 13-foot diameter, I know, it's great, 13-foot diameter vacuum chamber, where that vaporized aluminum would stick to the surface, producing a beautiful and perfect reflective surface on the mirror. Finally, by 1959, after years and years of delays, the 3-meter Shane telescope was operational and is still to this day the workhorse of the observatory. Every observable night of the year, the 3-meter Shane is making incredible discoveries. It remains certainly the most active telescope on the mountain, although we do use it a little differently than they did back then. Here you can see the observer's nest up at the top there, where observations would be made using film, of course. Nowadays we use CCD, and we use it actually at a totally different focus on that telescope, as a hole was drilled very carefully in that mirror to turn it into a cassia grain. But this telescope has yet another feather in its cap, and that is the moon landing, the very first one. Apollo 11, 1969. Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong landed the Sea of Tranquility, and they set up a variety of different scientific experiments. One of those was a reflector. The goal was that this telescope, the Shane, along with a few other large telescopes around the world, would actually shine a laser at that precise point where it was set up. And that laser would then be measured in the amount of time that it took for it to come back to Earth, giving us an extremely precise distance between the Earth and the moon. And so while the rest of the world was all watching the moon landing on television, astronomers at Lick Observatory were very carefully shooting a laser and bouncing it off the moon. Now, I'm sure you probably remember this telescope. We talked about it at the very beginning of the talk, that beautiful 12-inch Clark refractor. However, by 1979, it had been in place for over 91 years, and it was really starting to kind of show its age. Instead, the decision was now to replace it with a more modern telescope. And in the process, go ahead and make some necessary repairs. Its all-wood dome was starting to show signs of it being quite aged, and they needed to go in there and make some renovations. Even still, though, I do want to acknowledge it was an incredible telescope for many, many years. In fact, in the 1920s and 30s, which is from the image that you're seeing over here on the right, it was used in the pioneering field of electronic light detection, which would eventually, one day, kind of give birth to modern spectroscopy and modern astrophotography. But we wouldn't have been able to build it if not for a rather generous donation by a woman named Anna Nickel, who we have really no idea what she was all about. She was a seamstress in San Francisco. We know that from research. But we have no idea why she decided to leave money to the observatory. We're just very glad that she did. Even still, it wouldn't be enough to build a telescope as it had been built before. The estimates were about $750,000 if we wanted to build a reflecting telescope to go inside that dome. We had $50,000. So we had to figure out some way to make that all work. And thankfully, we also had something very valuable: grad students. Lots of them from Santa Cruz. And many of them decided that they would just build a telescope from spare parts. And that's exactly what they did. They scoured all around all the resources available to UC Santa Cruz and managed to create a telescope with really just spare parts laying around. In fact, we had a surplus. We had $28,000 left over when they were done. Thankfully, we did have a mirror that was all ready for us to use. It was one that had been purchased many, many years ago as a possible replacement for the Crosley 36-inch, and instead became repurposed for our spare parts telescope. With that, we were able to create the 40-inch nickel reflector. And it's a rather unique telescope in that it had to be designed to fit into this relatively small space. So it has a rather unique design, one that mirrors very closely its cousin over on the mountain, that being the 3-meter Shane telescope. Now, also in the 1970s and 80s were some pretty impressive enhancements in CCDs, digital light detection. This was the very beginning of it all. I think the original technology was invented in 1969, but pretty quickly the astronomical community out there realized its potential, and they started working and investing lots and lots of research projects into this. UC Santa Cruz was no different. In fact, they invented some of the first incredibly powerful digital light detectors for their age. Here you can see, one sample image, which, I'm sure you can all produce even better with your iPhone and a telescope out in your backyard right now. But at the time, that was absolutely revolutionary. And a lot of the advancements that were made in these CCDs, many of which, again, were built and tested at Lick Observatory, ended up in your phone, sitting in your pocket right now. So you're welcome. And that's going to bring us to the last part of our talk here: reinventing astronomy. Something that Lick Observatory has actually gotten very, very good at. Here you can see one of 2 robotic telescopes that we have up on the mountain. This is the 30-inch Katzmann telescope. And the Kate, as we often call it, was created with a donation of $50,000. And was really the brainchild of Alex Filipinko. You've probably seen him in plenty of documentaries. He's usually wearing a Hawaiian shirt and has a fun personality. I've met him many times. He's a real nice guy. But one of the great limitations of astronomy is the fact that you have to have eyeballs, or at least people, in front of that data all the time. If you, however, have a telescope that can operate completely autonomously every clear night of the day, or every clear night of the year, you've got a lot more data that you can work with. And that's perfect for the kind of observations that Alex was doing, looking for really energetic explosions, things like supernova. These happen very infrequently within our own galaxy, but happen frequently enough that at the time, people were discovering around the world about 2 supernova every month. With this telescope, however, and its automated capabilities, Alex and his team were able to discover 2 supernova every week. So they greatly increased the amount of data that was coming out of all of that. And in doing so, proved that these robotic telescopes were really going to be a huge asset to the future. Especially again, in the 90s, the fledgling project of discovering exoplanets, planets around other stars. A lot of early research was being done in this field at Lick Observatory, and a lot of those names helped push forward the creation of yet another robotic telescope. This is the APF, or the Automated Planet Finder. Now, it's an impressive telescope, actually 2.4 meters in diameter, and yet it fits in this relatively compact dome, extraordinarily claustrophobic. You have to wear a hard hat while you're in there. It is not meant for humans to walk around in there unless they are performing service. But with it, it uses a process of radial velocity to actually see the very faint wobble that is created by the gravitational influence of a planet around its parent star. And it's able to look for relatively small planets. So we're looking at small, rocky, Earth-like planets that are being made through these observations. Stephen S. Voigt is the UC Santa Cruz professor who's been in charge of, or was initially in charge of the APF and got everything kicked off and started here. And in the very beginning, Lick Observatory was discovering more planets around other stars than any other terrestrial-based telescope in existence. Now, of course, we've now sent these amazing space telescopes up there that can outperform the APF, but at its time, it was king of the mountain. Perhaps, however, an even more significant improvement in astronomy has been developed and worked on at Lick Observatory, and that is adaptive optics. Lick Observatory really was the birthplace of this incredibly important technology, now featured on every major telescope everywhere that observations are being made. For those in the room who are not familiar with this, I'll explain it in a little bit more detail in a moment, but I will say that it is, again, the brainchild of Claire Max, who worked in conjunction with not just UC Santa Cruz, but Lawrence Livermore Labs to first develop this technique for use in astronomy. Originally, it was developed for military use and actually looking the other direction through the atmosphere, but it has now since been repurposed for science. And here you can see the second generation adaptive optics attachment that we have for the Cassegrain focus of the 3-meter telescope. Now you're probably wondering, cool, well, where does it go? It goes right there. I spent my whole lunch break making that look nice, so I hope you appreciate that. Thank you. So it sits there at the Cassegrain focus on the 120. And the idea behind this is that we take light as it is passing through our atmosphere and being distorted by the atmosphere, and then we kind of undistort it, if you will. So if you imagine light passing through the atmosphere and it kind of becomes like a potato chip, it becomes kind of wavy, okay? When that wave hits a flat surface, it scatters, and the light no longer looks clear. But what if that surface could also be deformed to match the shape of the wave? That's what we do with adaptive optics. We study the light, and then very quickly, using the wavefront sensor, we adjust and change the shape of the mirror that it's actually bouncing off of and reflecting off of, so that we end up with a clear image. Like these. So the images on the left are with adaptive optics disabled, and then you can see the rather significant difference right there on the right. This technology is continuing to be refined. It's going to, I think, at some point get to a place where it will match space-based telescopes, which will be ever so important as we continue to build larger and larger classes of telescope. In fact, we continue to test new adaptive optic updates all the time. And one of the really neat things that we can do, really only at Lick Observatory and nowhere else, is that we can use our 40-inch nickel telescope, very similar in design to the 3-meter, to start small. Try things out, see if things are going to work or not without spending a whole bunch of money. And then, if things do work, scale that up, test it on the 3-meter, and if things look good there, roll it out around the world. And as I said, every major telescope in the world now has an adaptive optics system. They use this important technology to help us understand more about the universe around us. But there is something that people come up to the observatory all the time and they ask me, believe it or not, and that is, have I ever seen a UFO? People do ask me that, I'm not kidding. And while I can tell them I have never seen a UFO, I can say we are looking for aliens. It's true, we're part of PANOSETI. This is a new technique where we use these incredibly sensitive cameras to look for highly energetic bursts of energy that are out there that are not natural. they could only be created by intelligence. So maybe there's some sort of super powerful system of lasers being used for communication or something to that effect. And we've set them up inside that dome that we use for the astrograph. Not an active research telescope anymore, but has a perfectly great dome, and so we're able to use that as one location for our pano SETI. We actually have multiple locations on the mountain, a distance away from one another. And that way we can actually verify that the observations that we're making are happening outside of our atmosphere, and not some sort of rare, event that's occurring close to us. They're enough of a distance apart from each other that we can tell if they're close or if in fact they're far away. So who knows? I might be back here one day talking to you about, the discovery of extraterrestrial intelligence. Who knows? That would be pretty cool. Now, I hate to end on a sadder note, but I do have two events that have happened recently in Lick Observatory's history that I would be very remiss if I did not mention. And the first one occurred back on August 16th of 2020. This is the SCU complex fire. Those of you who were living in this area at the time probably remember it. One of the largest wildfires in California history, burning nearly 400,000 acres from August 16th to October 1st. Fourth largest overall. And Lick Observatory was right in its path. Now, there's not a very large population who live up on the mountain anymore. There were times when we peaked over 200. Even still, though, the 20 or so people who were living on the mountain at that time were forced to evacuate. The observatory has what we call the ham cam, and that is our Mount Hamilton webcam where we can check out weather conditions and see down into the bay. We turned it around so that we could watch the advance of the fire. The observatory has its own diesel generator, which takes over when the electricity goes out, and with that, the ham cam remained operational. What you're going to see now is the actual progression of that fire as it moved through Lick Observatory. So this is a time lapse constructed by my good friend and resident astronomer, Eleanor Gates. You can see that, CAL FIRE, while on scene, couldn't completely stop it in its tracks. They simply had to position themselves in different areas on the mountain to best protect certain structures, like the 3-meter telescope, which is in that large dome there, and the APF, which is in the smaller dome. The camera itself sits atop the main building where the historic telescopes are located. But some of those flames were reaching up over 100 feet into the air. And we know this from firsthand account because the former superintendent of the observatory, a man named Costas, he was the only one who didn't evacuate. He stayed behind. He worked with the CAL FIRE teams because he had lived on that mountain for over 20 years. He knew where everything was. He knew how to access all those little back paths and roads. And if it wasn't for that, there's a very good chance that we would have lost the entirety of the observatory. Even still, the damage was done. Here you can see its effect on the landscape. 2 structures were destroyed, one completely burned to the ground, that being the one that you see listed here. However, it wasn't a huge loss. It was actually planned for demolition, so fire kind of helped out with that one. Unfortunately, in a rather cruel twist of irony, the other home that was damaged beyond repair was Costas. His house that he had lived up there on for so many years was damaged. We, however, through the Friends of Lick Observatory, our kind of membership program up there, were able to generate some funds in order to get him relocated on the mountain, refurnished, and so, he was okay. Thankfully, no lives, of course, were lost. I do want to give a really big shout out to the brave men and women of CAL FIRE who, every single year it seems like they got to work extra hard to keep, structures and people safe, but they really did help save the observatory, so I'm very grateful for everything they did. And then Christmas came along, just this past year. And apparently we've been pretty naughty, because we got a little piece of coal in our stocking. Hurricane force winds, 114 miles per hour, hit the observatory, and with it, actually pulled off one of the shutters for the 36-inch telescope. 7 tons worth. And then dropped it directly onto the main building. Immediately, water from the storm began pouring in. Thankfully, everyone who lived up on the mountain had a very interesting Christmas morning. Instead of opening presents, they went to work. And a lot of our volunteers also made the way up the mountain to help with mitigation efforts to reduce the amount of damage that was being done. But as you can see, an enormous amount of water pooling here on the floor before we were able to put that protection into effect. Up here is Ellie, Eleanor Gates, the resident astronomer on the mountain who's been there the longest. She's been one of the key forces in making sure that all of this happened that day, so I always give her a special shout out and thank you. And then here you can see we brought in a specialized team to help prevent any further rainfall that was, at that point, no way we could really prevent it from getting in, just making sure that it wasn't damaging any other elements of the dome. Nonetheless, it's going to take a while. We're not there yet. I know some of you probably have questions around that. You're curious about when we're going to be able to reopen the observatory. And I wish that I could come here and share with you some special insider information, but I'll be honest, I really don't know. They haven't told me. I don't, that's not my pay grade. I don't get paid, I'm a volunteer. So what I can tell you though is that they are working in earnest in order to make sure that the observatory is repaired and available back to the public as it was originally intended by James Lick. This was his goal. Open it up as a gift to the people of California and of course to the world as a whole, and we are working hard to make sure that happens. So, to end my talk, I just want to let you all know how you can be a part of this future. If you'd like, you're more than welcome to join the Friends of Lick Observatory. This is a great program and a great way for you to get some rewards as you get specialized timing for buying tickets and discount in the gift shop, but you also, of course, support not just the observatory, but our repair efforts that are going on right now. Or you can come on up with my father and my daughters and I, and you can volunteer up at the observatory. It's a wonderful place to bring in either a telescope and set it up for outdoor scopes, or if you want to come inside and volunteer with us on the inside, you're welcome to do so. You can find out more about all the great stuff that we do, and we're continuing programs. We still have programs this summer. They're just going to be a lot smaller. They're going to be minimum of or maximum of 30 people instead of around 150 or 200, which is what we're normally able to do. But we will have an opportunity to go and check out the Shane. So if you really want to see more about that beautiful 3-meter telescope, it's a great opportunity to come up from one of those. Check out lickobservatory.org. I also thank Google, who donated $2 million back when the observatory was dealing with some pretty difficult times financially, and really helped us out a lot. So I always make sure to give a special thank you to Google. And a special thank you to a special guest in the room tonight, and that is my father. He's sitting up in the front here. He is by far the foremost authority on the history of Lick Observatory. He started our volunteer program back in 1996. He's been giving these history lectures a lot longer than I have, and I have been groomed as his successor, I guess. So hopefully I did you proud tonight, Dad. Hopefully I did well for you. I will say thank you to James Lick. Without James, we would not have this incredible telescope. And I truly believe that where we are in the field of astronomy would probably be 20 or 30 years behind where we are right now, if not for all those important discoveries that were made in those trailblazing years. My next question, though, is who's the next James Lick? Because remember, he donated that amazing $750,1880. Single largest donation from a private individual to a scientific institution if you account for inflation and other things. So who of you are going to be the next James Lick? Me? No, I have 4 kids. I don't have any money. And I guess the last folks I'll thank are all of you. Thank you very much. I'll say it for Larry. That was the most transformational experience he's ever had.
I won't use it. There are things in tonight's talk. I've been volunteering since 1997, thanks to Ron, up at Lick, and there are bits of information in this talk I hadn't heard before. So, and the other thing too, the vacuum chamber for the 120-inch. I know Eric didn't mention it, but that was a cyclotron from Lawrence Berkeley.
That is true.
That got converted to be an illuminization chamber.
Well, see, I learned something tonight too. I'm going to put that in my notes. Hold on, let me get that in there.
So anyway, questions for Eric?
Yeah.
I'm Bob Garfield on the author of the book, Luna Cognita, which are 3 volumes in the library there. What I have is part of my book that I write. Pass this around. Go ahead. Take a look and hand them over to the other side. It's about how to take pictures of the moon with objects around it. In 2005, a lady that I met named Pat, her husband was working up at Lick, and what she did is a couple of days before the full moon, they turn on all the lights in the observatory, open the dome so the lights are on, and the full moon, almost full moon, was behind Lick. You can look at the pictures, and so it looks like the moon is shining through the observatory. And so I made a couple copies from my book. And if you want to know the details on the other side of the text, it tells about how she did it. She was down in San Jose and shot up at the mountain. And so it was very nice. And I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you. I'll say I enjoy Lori Hatch very much. I've known her for many years. Her photography is incredible. A few of those shots were in my history talk tonight as well.
Yeah, copy of the picture is mounted on the wall at the observatory.
Yeah.
So if you want to see it in better detail.
Yeah, check out Lori Hatch's website. She's got all of her work up there. She's a very accomplished photographer. And she used to live on the mountain. Her husband, Remington, was the superintendent there for a number of years. Yes?
Yeah, we had her give a talk here, and she had wonderful photographs.
Yeah.
But I saw just recently that Dr. Gates took a photograph of an incredible, unusual flying object, and it was right going over the domes, and it was, when she blew it up, she could see the tag of the condor going across.
Yes. So condors do make their way over Lick Observatory. This is not anything new. This has happened a few times in the past. They just so happen to kind of migrate up this area from further south. And I can't remember exactly where they originate, but yeah. Yeah, probably pinnacles, most likely. I'm not sure. I mean, I would definitely, I know that Ellie has a Facebook page, and she also posts images on the Lick Observatory Facebook page, and I saw that same exact one. Yeah. Yes?
Do you have any comments on using refractors versus reflectors? I mean, I'm sure there was a discussion about that.
Yeah, for building the world's largest telescope, I would imagine you're referring to. Yeah, there was quite a bit of discussion at the time, and a lot of debate. And ultimately, the decision to go with a refractor was to go with what they knew, with a technology that was already proven, a technology that was reliable, that they could work with. And reflecting telescopes at that time, while they had been around since, Sir Isaac Newton, were not quite as reliable. They relied upon either all metal mirrors, which tarnished and had to be polished periodically and sometimes changed their shape in the process of frequent repolishing. And it was only, at that time, only Andrew Common's Crosley was that glass mirror that could be shaped, and then, later it would be re-illuminized. Before that, it would be re-silvered. I will say, actually, the Crosley, I forgot to mention this in my talk, was the very first telescope mirror to go through the process of illuminization. It was actually used as a test when that technique was first developed. But, I can't really blame them for going with the refractor. I still think that, like the 60-inch and the 100-inch were a few decades away. So it made sense for the time. But, that's how it goes. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yes. Can you talk a little bit about the process of when the original team that would look through the telescope and they had to redraw it by hand?
Yeah.
Was that like, how would they get the proportions right? And do you know anything?
Well, they didn't. I mean, they did their best. You did your best to observe in the window that you had, and did as rough an illustration as you could, that you could then base a more detailed illustration off of later, or over several nights if you had the time on that particular telescope. But it was also very much up to seeing conditions. So much of what we see in these Mars illustrations and so much of this confusion around these canals on Mars and there must be aliens on Mars really just had to do with viewing conditions that changed dramatically all the time. And they just didn't have the resolution to really see the detail that we can see today. So they did their best. And I think people like Keeler, who those two illustrations I showed you earlier, those were his. If you had really good eyesight, keen eyes, you could produce some pretty accurate and pretty fantastic illustrations. But at the time that the observatory was being built, photography was, while in its infancy, just starting to be used with astronomy. And so we knew, I think from the get-go, that kind of observation was going to be very limited and very short-lived, and that photography would really be the way of the future. And the 36-inch had its own cameras and took amazing glass negative exposures. And so not just the Crosley, also the 36-inch was used for photography through the vast majority of its operational time. It concluded its research in the 1970s for the most part. There was one research project that it wrapped up in the 2000s because it required like 30 years difference in observations. But it hasn't been used as a research telescope in a long time. Even still, though, you get the chance to go up there, hopefully, once things are fixed, and look through it, and look through the second most powerful refractor in the world. It's pretty cool. You can even put your iPhone camera up there and try to do your own photography if you want to. Yes?
I remember years ago reading that the main objective of the Lick refractor was resurfaced. How has that held up? Is it still in great condition now?
Yeah. I mean, I think that for a telescope of its age, it performs incredibly well. It is well maintained, and I think that it is. We do the most amount of service that we can do on it as much as we possibly can. So it is well taken care of. I'm grateful because it makes me think of all the trouble that Yerkes has had with the 40-inch. And the difficulties that they've had to deal with their lens and the crack that formed in their lens a number of years ago. They've actually had to put up blinders around it and kind of move it around within the tubing in order to readjust it so it's more like a 22-inch refractor now. So even if you went and looked through the 40-inch at Yerkes, you still wouldn't see the image that you see at Lick Observatory with the 36. It's unfortunate, and it has a lot to do with the fact of where it was located. Wisconsin's a great place for cheese and football, but not the best place to build a telescope. The pull and play of thermodynamics and the constant hot and cold and building it near a lake, you got all this humidity you got to deal with. It was no wonder that eventually they would run into a problem. But the weather at Lick Observatory has been consistent for 150 years. Yeah.
I'd like to mention that our board did vote to donate to Lick after the windstorm.
Thank you.
And it's not as much as Google, but
That's okay. We are grateful for even the smallest of donations, and we always have been. I think that the community has really shown its support, not just in these past few months, but for the entire history of the observatory. And so, thank you for anything and all that you can do to support it. We'll go here first, and then we'll head up back there. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how the semiconductor and CMOS technology is being upgraded in the cameras and capabilities of Lick?
No. I'll be honest, I can't. I don't know the details down that specific. I know that part of UC observatories and being part of the UC system, there are always research projects going on. There's always development being pushed forward. And I know particularly in the 1980s and the early 1990s, a lot of that really groundbreaking research was occurring at Lick Observatory. I don't know the state of it now. I don't know if we're still kind of in that same space as we were back then. I suspect probably not. But nonetheless, we're always working on something new up there, including adaptive optics. That's where I know we're always making strides forward and testing.
And I was asking Larry when you guys are going to adopt it so us amateurs can use it.
Great question. No idea.
That would be a great club project.
Yeah, why don't you guys do it?
There you go.
That'll put you on the map. Let's do it. Yeah.
Something about having a 20-watt sodium-ion laser.
Yeah. There's no regulations around that. Yes.
You showed the one telescope on the English mount, I forget what diameter it is, where one night an astronomer fell into the telescope.
Yes.
Didn't find it until the next morning,
Yeah.
and the telescope won't work because the rain got in and the gears are frozen.
So that was the Crosley, the 36-inch reflector. The astronomer in question had dropped his pipe into the telescope and thought it was a good idea to lean into it and get it out. Fell into the telescope and wasn't discovered until the next day, and they were able to get him out. I do not have a picture of that. There is. I've shown it. I'm trying to go back and find it. I have 144 slides in here. It's in here somewhere. But oh, come on now. Where are you, Crosley? Oh, here it is. Yeah, so that's the telescope in question. At a very different time period is where this event occurred. I don't have a later picture where there's actually a whole scaffolding built up and around the telescope. And so you can't, it's hard to imagine what I'm talking about from this image.
That was a linoleum floor on the scaffolding.
Yeah.
Pretty bad shape last time I saw it, and you probably slipped on it because linoleum can be rather slippery.
Quite possibly, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Eric, once again.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Larry.